Recently, I was watching a cooking competition program. Now, this was a program to bring amateur cooks, so people probably like us here who have a passion for cooking, and to find out who would be the best. Over the many weeks of this cooking competition, I was really amazed by all of the candidates, but one stuck out for me, and her name is Saliha. She did amazing things with food, and she was so calm under the pressure, so relaxed and focused. Clearly, in my mind, Saliha was the best. Well, fortunately, the judges agreed with me, and she was one of the 3 finalists. Now, television is television, and in that last program, they were portraying the 3 finalists and giving us a bit of information about them. And I watched with interest because up to that point, I was only focused on their performance. How good were they as a cook? Through television. Going into that, listening in to those final pieces about who these 3 people were, I was quite interested. And so, as I talked about the first candidate and who she was, they had a little video clip. And they showed her at her home in Cambridge, and she was playing classical music on the piano. Now, I don't know how that lands in your mind, but in my mind, in a split second, I thought, privileged. Okay, they went on to the second candidate, and they were talking about him and his background, and that he was raised by a single mother, and he had a hard time in school, really difficult time, but he managed to turn it around, and he has things, going well now in his life. So, in my mind, how I heard that was, aww. The third finalist was Saliha. Now remember, that's the one I was rooting for and thinking was the best, the clear best. What I learned about Saliha is she's a doctor. Not only is she a doctor, her parents are doctors, her siblings are doctors, and guess what? Her partner's a doctor. And she has a young child. And on top of the many weeks of this cooking competition, she was working full-time as a doctor, had full home life. And in that split second, I thought, she clearly doesn't need any help. She's got her life all sorted out. And in a split second, I switched and said, candidate number 2, he should win. He's had a hard time of it. He deserves this. What just happened here? How did I go from judging what I thought was clear competition on cooking to all of a sudden being influenced by some small details? Well, fortunately, that didn't happen with the judges, and Saliha was declared the winner. But there we have it. My biased thinking revealed. My goals of assessing who was the best talent quickly shifted, and my decision did not match up to my goal. So if this happened to me, me of all people, someone who loves cooking, and someone who's been working in the field of inclusion and gender and equality and diversity for over 20 years, well, what hope do we have in the workplace? What does this mean for managers and employees when they're selecting who would be the best talent? We know the success of organizations rests on its people. And hiring good talent is critical, yet bias comes up. Researchers at Harvard University asked the question, have you ever been treated unfairly at work because of someone else's bias? And over 89% said yes. This included men, women, white people, and non-white people. Clearly, bias is all around us, and bias is impacting all of us. So what do we need to do differently to mitigate, to lessen the impact of bias in our thinking and decision-making? Well, one of the first steps is to understand how this is happening. As we know from the work done by Daniel Kahneman and many other researchers, that we have two systems of thinking. The first part of our brain is sometimes called the fast brain or the unconscious brain, that early primitive part of our brain. And thank goodness we have that. That's allowing us to regulate our breathing, you're automatically, many of you here, fanning yourselves to cool off, and it has ensured our survival as a species. So we're here today, thankfully, because of our fast brain. But the challenge is also, we like to think that our slow brain is the one in control. That's what's sometimes referred to as the rational brain, and that's where we use when we're learning something new, or we're doing very concentrated focus. The vast majority of our thinking, however, is in that automatic fast brain. It processes more than 11 million bits of information per second, whereas the slow brain, only 40 bits of information per second. And that significantly decreases when we're multitasking. So, our brain develops shortcuts to enable it to be able to cope with these two systems of thinking and really try to speed things along automatically, fast, with shortcuts. But are shortcuts helpful? I have never met anyone who said, I want to discriminate. I want to treat people unfairly. I just want to hire people like me. No, that's not our intentions. Yet we know that this happens. And what's happening is that fast brain is getting in the way of our intentions of being fair, of making objective decisions and good decisions. So looking in at the workplace, let's take gender equity as an example or a case study. Most organizations, if they're doing work on diversity and inclusion, are doing work on gender equity. It is one of the one common themes that's true around the world for a focus here. In this space, so much work has been done, decades of work, certainly the span of my career. And what we are finding is that the vast amount of resources that have been dedicated to gender parity and achieving it are not actually living up to what we hope for. So, for example, in the top 3 actions that most organizations are doing when they're addressing gender parity, bringing in awareness training or unconscious bias training is in those top 3. In the US alone, it's estimated that more than $8 billion a year is spent on diversity and inclusion awareness programs or unconscious bias awareness programs. Yet the studies and research are showing actually these are not as effective as we would hope, not having the outcomes that we would hope, and in many cases, backfiring. We're getting the opposite behavior. If we look at the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Report, we see that progress is happening on women's education levels increasing. However, in the workplace, we find that it's still not more than 30% women on average in leadership roles, and it is estimated that it will take more than 170 years to reach global gender economic parity. Clearly, something has to shift. We need to rock the boat and challenge the status quo. We're in a stuck pattern of doing a lot of activities, but something is not going in the way that we want it to go. Well, this is what brought my partner, Tina Nielsen, and I together in 2013. At that time, we were both working in multinationals, different multinationals, and a mutual friend introduced us and said, "You two think differently, I think you should talk. And indeed we did. We found that we were applying different ways of doing the work on inclusion and diversity, from social psychology, from anthropology, and in particular, behavioral economics. Tina and I, in that phone call, and shortly thereafter said, let's start a global movement and change the way that gender equality and inclusion and diversity work is taking place. And so we launched our nonprofit, Inclusion Nudges, to be able to share what we do to help work with the fast brain, to make decision-making more aligned to our intentions, to be fair, to have equality, and make good decisions. Inclusion Nudges are based on behavioral economics, and it is about how to make this simpler to do. We have seen so much in the space of inclusion and diversity not working. Blaming, shaming, those aren't effective. Having massive goals and targets that are unrealistic are not driving change. Instead, we really need to take what we know about human motivation, how we make decisions, and apply that to how we work for inclusion inside organizations to try and help close this gap of our good intentions, let's be fair, and our actual decision-making and behavior. Let's do 3 examples I'll share with you. So one thing around our movement on inclusion nudges, these are real-life proven examples that have been applied inside organizations, and we share to inspire others to take that back to their workplace, and we want to hear from you. So I hope this sparks for you some ideas of how you could apply this in your organization. As individuals, we tend to gravitate to people who are like us. It's what we do, it's safety, we feel comfortable, and we actually like them more because they're like us. We trust them more, and when we have opportunities, we turn to them with those opportunities. The challenge is that if we want to have a wide range of talent in our organizations, we need to look beyond the in-group. We need to challenge the status quo. So one example of an inclusion nudge, which we call a feel the need inclusion nudge, that I designed for an organization on this topic was, I pulled together the photographs of all the people in the talent pool for senior executive roles. And we had them up on a slide similar to this in an executive meeting. And I asked the leaders, so how many of these people do you know? And they started shouting out the names in competition, who knew more. And I faded to the next slide after 2-3 minutes. And the next slide actually were the same photographs, but the male colleagues' pictures had been faded out. So what remained were only the female. And there was a lot less of them in that pipeline. And what the leaders learned when I asked the question on that slide, so how many of these people do you know? They realized they actually didn't have a wide visibility of that pipeline. And they certainly didn't know them at the level that they knew the male colleagues. That nudge was a aha moment, where they realized they didn't have full visibility and they needed to do something differently. The second example is fairly easy. It's framing. It's how we see things, and it works on perception. When we think about leaders, oftentimes we have an anchor or thought point of what a leader looks like, and it tends to be what is already in place. And so we're stuck in a pattern of replicating leadership in the same models. So many organizations are doing nudges such as changing conference rooms or changing the artwork in the building to try and show a wider perspective of who leaders could be and changing that thought anchor point. And lastly, one example that we have in terms of process nudges. So if we accept that in our organizations we have systems and processes, and they were designed by us, and we are biased, it's not far to assume that we could have potentially unintentional bias built into our systems and processes. And blind CVs is an excellent example of a process nudge where you remove all identifying details from the CV. And when organizations do this, they find they bring in much more diverse talent. So, as we go forward and think about how to have the benefits that equality can bring to our workplaces and society, let's try and work with our whole brain, not just the rational. We also need to work with the fast or automatic part of the brain and design interventions to help steer our decision-making and our behaviors to be aligned to our true intentions. Thank you.